the hook. Until tonight, Doc thought he'd carry that secret to his grave. The pounding on his apartment door came at 11:47 p.m., violent enough to rattle the medical certificates hanging crooked on his walls. Through the peephole, he saw a woman in her 50s, rain-soaked and furious, clutching something against her chest like a weapon. "Dr. Wellington." Her voice cut through the door. "I know you're in there. I found my father's journals." Doc's blood turned to ice water. Frazier's daughter. He'd seen her picture in the sports pages over the years. Jackie Frazier lied, the boxer who tried to follow her father's footsteps before life pulled her in different directions. But this wasn't the composed woman from those photos. This was someone who'd stumbled onto something that could destroy him. "I don't know what you're talking about," he called back, his voice cracking like old leather. "November 15th, 1995, she shouted. "Warehouse outside Philadelphia. You, my father, and Muhammad Ali. Ring any bells, Doc?" His hands trembled as he reached for the deadbolt. Not the slight tremor of old age, the violent shake of a man whose past had just kicked down his door. Behind him, 40 years of guilt seemed to press against his shoulders like physical weight. The cluttered apartment suddenly felt like a tomb filled with evidence, yellowed fight programs, medical files in cardboard boxes, photographs of two men who'd beaten each other senseless for the entertainment of millions. When he opened the door, she pushed past him without invitation, water dripping from her jacket onto his threadbare carpet. In the lamplight, she looked exactly like Joe. Same determined jaw, same eyes that had seen too much pain. "You son of a bitch," she whispered, and Doc knew his 40-year run was over. She threw a leather-bound journal onto his coffee table, pages falling open to reveal Joe Frazier's handwriting. Doc didn't need to read it. He remembered every word Joe had said that night, every promise extracted in that warehouse when two dying legends decided their rivalry needed one final chapter. "My father wrote everything down," Jackie said, pacing like a caged fighter. "Every conversation, every plan, every detail about what you three did in that warehouse." She spun to face him. "Including what you did afterward." Doc sank into his recliner, suddenly feeling every one of his 72 years. The chair creaked under his weight, a sound like old bones settling. Around them, the apartment's shadows seemed to deepen, hiding corners filled with medical equipment he'd stolen from the hospital, files he should have burned decades ago. "It was supposed to stay buried," he said quietly. "Buried?" Her laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "My father died thinking the whole world saw him as a failure. Ali got the glory, the legacy, the love. Joe got the brain damage and the bitterness." She picked up the journal, pages trembling in her grip. "But this says otherwise. This says my father won something that night. Something that would change everything people believe about their rivalry." Doc closed his eyes, and for a moment he was back in that warehouse. The smell of old metal and motor oil. The sound of two old men breathing hard as they circled each other. Ali's hands shaking from Parkinson's, Frazier squinting through eyes clouded by decades of punishment. The makeshift ring illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights that made their shadows look like giants. He'd begged them not to fight, pleaded with them to walk away. But pride was a cancer that had been eating at both men for 20 years, and this was their only chance for surgery. "You don't understand what you're asking," Doc said, opening his eyes to find her staring at him with her father's intensity. "Some secrets protect people, even dead people. Protect them?" She slammed the journal down. "Or protect you?" The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke. Outside, Atlantic City's neon lights flickered through his windows, casting red and blue shadows across the walls. In the distance, he could hear the ocean, the same sound that had lulled him to sleep every night for 15 years, ever since he'd fled Philadelphia and tried to disappear into this dying resort town. Jackie pulled out her phone, thumb hovering over the screen. "I've already contacted 3 reporters. Sports Illustrated, ESPN, The Philadelphia Inquirer. They're very interested in this story." Her smile was cold as winter. "Unless you want to tell me what really happened that night. All of it." Doc stared at the journal on his table, seeing not paper and ink but 2 men who'd trusted him with something more precious than their lives, their legacies. The promise he'd made them carried more weight than the Hippocratic oath he'd sworn as a young doctor. Some secrets were meant to die with the people who created them. But looking at Jackie Frazier Lyde's face, seeing her father's determination burning in her eyes, Doc realized his time as guardian of that secret was ending whether he chose it or not. The only question now was whether he'd control how the story came out, or watch her tear it from his cold, dead hands. Doc's fingers found the scar on his left palm, a nervous habit 40 years in the making. The thin, white line ran from his thumb to his wrist, a souvenir from that November night when he'd cut his hand breaking up broken glass from a whiskey bottle Ali had hurled against the warehouse wall. He'd never told anyone how he got it, not even Sarah. Sarah. The thought of his daughter hit him like a body blow. She lived 3 hours north in New York, a successful pediatric surgeon who called every Sunday at exactly 8 p.m. She'd be expecting his call tomorrow night, would want to hear about his week, about whether he'd finally cleaned out those medical files like he kept promising. Sarah had her mother's gentle laugh and her father's stubborn streak, and she was the only good thing Doc had managed not to destroy in 7 decades of living. If this story broke, if Jackie followed through on her threats, Sarah would learn what kind of man her father really was. Not the principled doctor who'd sacrificed a lucrative practice to work with fighters, helping broken men piece themselves back together. She'd discover he was the kind of man who'd helped orchestrate the most dangerous unsanctioned fight in boxing history, then spent 40 years lying about it. "You have no idea what you're playing with," Doc said, his voice barely above a whisper. He could smell the rain Jackie had tracked in, mingling with the apartment's familiar cocktail of old paper, liniment, and the Chinese takeout he'd forgotten to throw away 3 days ago. "This isn't just about your father or Ali or me. There are other people, innocent people, who'll get hurt if this comes out." Jackie had stopped pacing, and now stood silhouetted against the window, neon light painting her face in shades of red and gold. The resemblance to Joe was uncanny in profile. The same proud bearing, the same refusal to back down even when backing down was the smart play. "Innocent people like who?" she asked. Doc's eyes drifted to the mantelpiece, where a framed photo of Sarah graduating medical school sat beside a faded picture of him with Ali after the first Frazier fight. Sarah was beaming in her cap and gown, her arm around her father's shoulders, looking at him like he was her hero. The photo had been taken 12 years ago, back when she still believed the sanitized version of his life he'd carefully constructed. "Like my daughter," he said finally. "Like Ali's family, who've spent years watching him deteriorate from Parkinson's, not knowing—" He stopped himself before saying too much. Not knowing what? Doc rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building behind his eyes. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, claustrophobic. 40 years of carefully maintained silence was cracking like old plaster, and he could feel the weight of it all threatening to come crashing down. "You want the truth?" He stood slowly, joints protesting, and walked to the window. Below them, Atlantic City's boardwalk stretched into darkness, mostly empty except for a few late-night wanderers and the homeless men who gathered around the barrel fires. The truth is that some stories are too big for the people living them. Some secrets grow so heavy that the only merciful thing to do is bury them. He turned back to find Jackie watching him intently, her father's journal clutched against her chest like armor. In the lamplight, he could see the exhaustion around her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged with the weight of whatever she'd discovered in Joe's writings. "My father died broken," she said. "The great Joe Frazier, reduced to making appearances at autograph shows and county fairs. People forgot what he accomplished. They remembered him as the guy who lost to Ali, not as the man who knocked him down, not as the champion he was. And you think exposing this will change that? I think my father deserves the truth told about him, whatever that truth is." Doc moved to his kitchen, more to buy time than from any real thirst, and poured himself a glass of water from the tap. The water tasted metallic, like blood, and for a moment he was transported back to that warehouse, cleaning cuts on both men's faces while they argued about the decision, about what it meant, about who had really won. "Some truths destroy more than they heal," he said, setting down the glass. "Some truths turn heroes into cautionary tales." Outside, a police siren wailed in the distance, and Doc found himself wondering if those reporters Jackie had mentioned were already working their phones, chasing down leads, preparing to tear apart a story that 3 men had agreed should die with them. He looked at his hands. Surgeon's hands, healer's hands, now spotted with age and trembling with the weight of decisions made in darkness. These hands had saved lives, had stitched up fighters so they could return to the ring, had held secrets that could topple empires. Tomorrow, Sarah would call, and he'd have to decide whether to tell her the truth or let her discover it in the morning papers. The choice, like so many others, might already be out of his hands. The phone rang at 6:23 a.m., jarring Doc from the first real sleep he'd managed in 3 hours. He'd finally dozed off in his recliner around 3 a.m., after Jackie had left with promises to call those reporters by morning. Now the shrill electronic cry cut through his apartment like a scalpel, and Doc knew with the certainty of a man who'd spent 40 years waiting for this moment that his time was up. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, a Philadelphia area code that made his stomach clench. He let it ring 4 times before his shaking hand found the receiver. "Dr. Wellington?" The voice was young, female, crisp with the efficiency of someone who started work before sunrise. "This is Amanda Chen from the Philadelphia Inquirer. I'm calling about a story involving Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. I understand you might have some information about an undocumented fight that took place in 1995? Doc's mouth went dry. Through his window, the pre-dawn Atlantic City skyline looked gray and lifeless, like a photograph left too long in the sun. He could hear the reporter's pen clicking on the other end of the line, an impatient rhythm that reminded him of rainfall on the warehouse roof that November night. "I don't know what you're talking about," he managed, the same words he'd used with Jackie 12 hours earlier. They sounded even less convincing now. "Mr. Frazier's daughter contacted our sports desk yesterday evening," the reporter continued, undeterred. "She has documentation suggesting that you served as the physician for a private bout between the two fighters. She also mentioned that you might have information about the medical aftermath of that encounter." Doc closed his eyes, and suddenly he was back in that warehouse, watching Ali struggle to lift his gloves after the 4th round, seeing the way Joe's left eye had swollen completely shut. The sound of their breathing in that cold space had been like broken bellows, each exhale a reminder of what time and punishment had stolen from them. "Ms. Chen," he said carefully, "I've been retired for over a decade. My memory isn't what it used to be." The reporter's laugh was sharp. "Dr. Wellington, with respect, this isn't something a man forgets. According to Miss Frazier lied, her father's journals described this fight in extraordinary detail. They also mentioned certain irregularities in the medical documentation from that period." The word irregularities hit Doc like a punch to the solar plexus. He thought about the files in his bedroom closet, the ones he should have destroyed years ago but couldn't bring himself to burn. Medical records that showed what those two men had really endured, not just that night in 1995, but in all the years leading up to it. Documentation that would prove they had no business being in a ring together, that what happened in that warehouse wasn't brave, it was criminal. "I'll need to call you back," Doc said. "Dr. Wellington, I should mention that we're planning to run this story in tomorrow's edition, with or without your cooperation." The line went dead, leaving Doc holding the receiver like it might explode. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded him absurdly of the bruises on Ali's ribs after that final round. He stumbled to his kitchen and put on coffee with hands that shook so violently he spilled grounds across the counter. The mundane act of measuring water and finding filters felt surreal, like arranging deck chairs on the Titanic. By tomorrow morning, his name would be in newspapers across the country. By tomorrow evening, Sarah would know the truth about the man who'd raised her. The coffee maker gurgled to life, its familiar sound a small comfort in a world that had suddenly shifted on its axis. Doc leaned against the counter and stared at the medical certificates on his wall. 43 years of practicing medicine, of helping people heal, all about to be overshadowed by one night when he'd helped 2 dying legends destroy themselves for pride. His answering machine blinked insistently. 7 new messages. Doc didn't need to listen to know what they were. More reporters, more questions, more people wanting to tear apart a secret that had been carefully buried for 4 decades. He poured coffee into a chipped mug that read "World's Greatest Dad," a Father's Day gift from Sarah when she was 12. The irony tasted more bitter than the dark roast. The phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed Sarah's number. Doc stared at the display, knowing that once he answered, everything would change forever. His daughter was calling 3 hours early, which meant she'd already heard something. In 6 hours, she'd know the whole story. In 12 hours, the boxing world would learn that their greatest heroes had fought one last time when they should have been in nursing homes, not a makeshift ring. The phone kept ringing, each electronic cry an accusation. Outside, Atlantic City was waking up to what might be Doc Wellington's last morning, as a man whose secrets were still his own. He reached for the phone. "Dad?" Sarah's voice carried the controlled concern of a surgeon delivering bad news, professional, measured, but with an undercurrent of worry that made Doc's chest tighten. "I just got the strangest call from a reporter asking about you and some boxers. What's going on?" Doc set down his coffee mug with exaggerated care, watching the dark liquid slosh against the ceramic. Through the kitchen window, Atlantic City's morning joggers were beginning their routes along the boardwalk, their rhythmic footfalls a counterpoint to his racing heart. "Probably nothing, sweetheart," he said, the lie tasting like ash. "You know how these sports reporters are, always looking for angles that don't exist." A pause. In the background, he could hear the familiar sounds of Sarah's morning routine, coffee brewing, NPR murmuring from her kitchen radio, the efficient movements of a woman who'd inherited her father's need for order. The normalcy of it made his throat constrict. "Dad," she mentioned Joe Frazier specifically, and something about medical records from 1995. Sarah's voice had shifted into the tone she used with difficult parents in the pediatric ICU, patient but unyielding. She said his daughter contacted them with documentation. Doc walked to his recliner and sank into the worn leather, suddenly feeling every bruise and ache accumulated over 7 decades. The apartment around him felt like a museum of his own guilt. Fight programs scattered across tables, medical journals stacked in corners, photographs of men he'd helped patch together after they'd willingly broken themselves for sport. "Sarah, listen to me," he began, then stopped. What could he say? That he'd spent 40 years lying to her? That the principled physician she thought she knew had orchestrated something that violated every ethical standard he'd ever claimed to hold? That her Sunday phone calls had been the only clean thing in his life, untainted by the secrets that poisoned everything else? "I'm listening," she said quietly. Before he could respond, his call waiting beeped. The display showed another unfamiliar number, this one with a New York area code, ESPN probably, or Sports Illustrated. The vultures were circling now, drawn by whatever story Jackie had fed them. Doc let it go to voicemail, but the damage was done. Sarah had heard the beep, knew he was fielding multiple calls at 7 in the morning. "How many reporters have called you?" she asked. "A few." Doc's gaze fell on a framed photograph sitting on his side table, himself with Allie and Frazier after their second fight in 1974, all 3 men younger and harder, before time had revealed the true cost of their ambitions. In the photo, both fighters looked invincible. In reality, Doc had already begun documenting the early signs of neurological damage that would define their later years. "Dad, you're scaring me." The simple honesty in her voice nearly broke him. Sarah had been 8 when her mother died, and Doc had raised her with a mixture of overprotection and medical precision that had somehow produced a woman more capable than he'd ever been. She'd chosen pediatric surgery partly because of him, inspired by stories of her father helping broken athletes heal. The irony was staggering. "There might be some stories coming out," he said finally, "about things that happened a long time ago, before you were born. Ancient history that some people want to dig up. What kind of things?" Doc stood and walked to his bedroom, where cardboard boxes lined one wall like accusations. Inside those boxes were medical files he should have destroyed decades ago. Documentation of brain scans, blood work, neurological assessments that painted a picture of 2 men deteriorating far more rapidly than the public ever knew. And buried deepest, the files from November 15, 1995. He pulled out a manila folder marked simply FA 1195 and opened it to reveal photographs that still made his stomach turn. Pre-fight medical evaluations showing both men as medically unfit for competition. Post-fight documentation of injuries that should have sent them both to the hospital. His own handwritten notes describing what he'd witnessed and what he'd agreed to keep silent about. "Dad, are you still there?" I'm here. He closed the folder and slid it back into the box. Sarah, I want you to know that everything I ever did, I did because I thought it was right at the time. Sometimes doctors have to make impossible choices. Another call was coming in, this time from a Los Angeles number. His answering machine would be full by noon, his voicemail overflowing with questions he couldn't answer without destroying everything he'd built since that warehouse night. You're starting to scare me, Sarah repeated. Whatever this is about, we'll figure it out together, okay? Doc closed his eyes and tried to imagine explaining it all to her. The secret fight, the cover-up, the medical records he'd falsified, the promises he'd made to protect two legends who'd refused to accept their own mortality. Instead, he said, I love you, sweetheart, more than anything in this world. When he hung up, Doc realized his attempt to stay safe had already failed completely. The silence after ending the call with Sarah felt like a held breath before drowning. Doc stared at the phone in his trembling hands, knowing he'd just lied to the person he loved most in the world. The weight of that deception settled into his chest like a tumor, growing heavier with each passing second. He shuffled back to the boxes in his bedroom, but this time pulled out a different folder, one marked Personal, 1995. Inside were photographs he'd never shown anyone, images from that warehouse night that had nothing to do with medical documentation. Ali slumped on a makeshift stool between rounds, his famous hands shaking as Doc tried to check his pupils. Frazier spitting blood into a bucket, his face so swollen he looked like a different man entirely. And the final photograph, both fighters embracing after it was over, two broken champions who'd given everything they had left for an audience of one. The phone rang again. Doc ignored it, but the sound triggered a memory so vivid it made him gasp. That same shrill electronic cry had echoed through the warehouse that night, cutting through the silence after the final bell. It had been Joe's phone, his manager trying to reach him, wondering where he'd disappeared to. Joe had looked at the ringing device like it was a snake, then deliberately let it go unanswered. Some conversations, Joe had said, his voice thick with exhaustion and blood, ain't worth having. Now Doc understood exactly what he'd meant. The next call came from his own building's front desk. Mrs. Kowalski, the day manager, sounded flustered. Dr. Wellington? There are people down here asking about you. Reporters, I think. They want to come up. Doc's stomach dropped. How many people? 3 so far. Maybe more coming. They've got cameras. Through his window, Doc could see a news van pulling up across the street. Then another. The careful life he'd constructed in Atlantic City, anonymous, quiet, forgotten, was dissolving in real time. By noon, his building would be surrounded. By evening, his photograph would be on every sports website in America. Don't let anyone up, he said. Please. Of course not. But Dr. Wellington? What's this about? These people seem very persistent. Doc hung up without answering. He walked to his kitchen window and peered down at the street. A woman with perfectly styled hair was speaking into a microphone while a cameraman filmed her. Behind them, Doc could see other reporters setting up equipment, preparing for what looked like an extended siege. His hands found the coffee mug Sarah had given him, world's greatest dad, and he hurled it against the wall with sudden, violent rage. The ceramic exploded into dozens of pieces that scattered across his kitchen floor like shrapnel. The sound was immensely satisfying and completely inadequate. 40 years. 40 years of carrying this weight, of protecting people who'd never asked for protection, of living with the knowledge that he'd been complicit in something that could have killed both men. And now, it was all unraveling, because Joe Frazier's daughter wanted the world to know her father's truth. But what was the truth? That 2 aging gladiators had been so consumed by pride and rivalry that they'd risked everything for one last moment of glory? That he'd enabled them because he'd been too weak to say no? That the greatest fight in boxing history had been witnessed by nobody except a guilt-ridden doctor who'd spent 4 decades wishing he'd had the courage to stop it? Doc knelt and began picking up pieces of the broken mug, cutting his finger on a sharp edge. The blood looked almost black against his pale skin, a reminder that even at 72 he could still bleed. Unlike Ali and Frazier, who by 1995 had already bled themselves dry for a sport that had forgotten them. His answering machine was blinking frantically now. 14 messages. 15. The number climbed as he watched, each new call another nail in the coffin of his carefully constructed anonymity. He thought about Sarah, probably fielding calls of her own by now. Her colleagues would be asking questions. Her patients' parents would recognize the name from news reports. The life she'd built as Dr. Sarah Wellington, respected pediatric surgeon, daughter of a principled sports physician, would be tainted by association with whatever version of this story eventually emerged. The worst part was knowing that none of it would bring Joe Frazier back. None of it would cure Ali's Parkinson's or restore the years that fight had stolen from both men. The truth Jackie wanted so desperately to reveal wouldn't heal anything. It would only transfer the burden of carrying it from 3 people to millions. Doc stood slowly, his knees protesting, and walked to his bathroom medicine cabinet. Behind the prescription bottles and first aid supplies, wrapped in an old towel, was the thing he'd sworn he'd never look at again, a videotape labeled only with a date, November 15th, 1995. Someone had filmed that night after all. Someone had documented every brutal minute of what happened in that warehouse. And now, Doc had to decide whether to destroy the evidence or watch his world burn. Doc held the videotape like it might spontaneously combust. His hands trembled as he read the date written in his own careful handwriting, November 15th, 1995. For 40 years, he'd convinced himself this was the only record of that night, the only evidence that 2 dying legends had nearly killed themselves for pride. But if he had a tape, who else might have one? The question hit him like a physical blow. In all his guilt-ridden decades of secrecy, he'd never considered the obvious. Someone else had been there. Someone else had witnessed everything. Someone who'd been smart enough or calculating enough to film it. Doc's legs gave out, and he collapsed onto his bathroom floor. The videotape clutched against his chest. The warehouse hadn't been empty except for him, Ali, and Joe. There'd been someone in the shadows, someone with a camera, someone who'd let him believe for 40 years that he was the sole guardian of this terrible secret. He'd been played. The realization rewrote every memory. Ali's insistence on that specific warehouse, not random but carefully chosen. Joe's strange calm before the fight, like a man following a script. The way both fighters had looked past Doc during their pre-fight medical checks, as if waiting for some signal he couldn't see. They'd all been lying to him. Doc struggled to his feet and stumbled back to his living room, where his answering machine continued its frantic blinking. 23 messages now. He hit play with shaking fingers. Dr. Wellington. This is Marcus Chen from ESPN. We have footage of the 1995 bout between Ali and Frazier. We'd like to get your comment before... Doc's finger stabbed the delete button. Footage. They had footage. The next message began. Dr. Wellington, Channel 7 Sports. We understand you were the attending physician for what's being called the ghost fight. We have video evidence that... Delete. Dr. Wellington. This is TMZ. Our sources tell us you've been sitting on the sports story of the century. Delete. Each message was a variation of the same theme. They all had video. They all had evidence. They were all calling him for comment on a story that was already written, already packaged, already destroying everything he'd tried to protect. But who had filmed it? And why had they waited 40 years to surface? The answer came with message number 18. Hello, Doc. This is Vincent Tremonti. You remember me, Joe's old manager? I think it's time we talked. Doc's blood turned to ice. Vinnie Tremonti, the man who'd made the arrangements for that warehouse night. The man who'd promised it would be completely private, completely secret. The man who'd looked Doc in the eye and sworn no one would ever know. The man who'd apparently filmed everything. Doc sank into his recliner as the truth crystallized with horrible clarity. The fight hadn't been a spontaneous moment of pride between 2 aging warriors. It had been staged, orchestrated, planned by people who understood that someday, when Ali and Frazier were both gone, the footage would be worth millions. And Doc, principled Dr. Wellington, had been the perfect patsy, the respectable physician whose presence would legitimize the whole thing, the unwitting accomplice who'd carry the guilt while the real architects waited for their payday. His phone rang. The caller ID showed Tremonti's number. Doc answered without thinking. You son of a bitch, he whispered. Tremonti's laugh was like sandpaper. Hello, Doc. 40 years is a long time to keep a secret, don't you think? You filmed it. You filmed everything and let me think. Let you think what? That you were some noble guardian of their legacy? Tremonti's voice carried the casual cruelty of a man revealing his hand after decades of bluffing. Doc, you were always just the medical window dressing, the guy with the credentials to make it look legitimate. The apartment around Doc seemed to shift and blur. Every memory of that night was tainted now, every moment of guilt and agonized conscience revealed as naive self-importance. He hadn't been protecting anyone. He'd been a prop in someone else's production. Allie and Joe, Doc managed. Did they know? Did they know you were filming? Of course they knew. Tremonti's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who'd waited 40 years to deliver this blow. You think two guys that smart would step into a ring without making sure they'd get paid for it eventually? This was always about the money, Doc. Always about setting up their families for life. Doc thought about Jackie's visit, her righteous anger about her father's story being buried. Had she known? Had her outrage been as orchestrated as everything else? The families are all in on it, he said, not really asking. Welcome to the real world, Doc. The fight was real, but everything else, all that noble bullshit about pride and legacy, that was just for you, to make sure you'd play your part and keep your mouth shut when it mattered. The phone slipped from Doc's fingers as the final piece fell into place. He hadn't spent 40 years protecting boxing's greatest legends. He'd spent 40 years being boxing's greatest fool. The phone lay on the carpet where it had fallen, Tremonti's voice still crackling through the speaker like poison in the air. Doc stared at it, his 72-year-old hands trembling not from age but from the volcanic rage building in his chest. 40 years. 40 years of sleepless nights, of medical ethics twisted into knots, of carrying guilt that had eaten him alive from the inside, all of it orchestrated by men who'd viewed him as nothing more than a useful fool. He picked up the phone. Tremonti was still talking, something about timing and market value, his voice carrying the satisfied smugness of a man revealing a long-planned con. You're done, Doc said quietly. What's that, Doc? I said you're done. Doc's voice gained strength with each word. You want to play this game? You want to cash in on those two men suffering? Fine. But you made one mistake, Vinny. The line went quiet, except for Tremonti's breathing. You assumed I was just some naive old doctor who'd roll over when the truth came out. You assumed I'd slink away in shame while you and the families divided up the profits. Doc walked to his bedroom, pulling out the box marked FA 1195 with deliberate precision. But I'm not just a witness to what happened that night. I'm the only person alive who knows what really happened to those men medically. And trust me, it's not the story you want told. Doc, I think you're misunderstanding the situation here. No, Vinny, you're misunderstanding. Doc pulled out a thick file, pages yellowed with age but every word still legible. You have footage of a fight. I have documentation of two men who should never have been cleared for competition. Medical records showing traumatic brain injury that I ignored. Blood work indicating both fighters were on medications that made competition potentially fatal. Neurological assessments that would have banned them from any legitimate athletic commission in the country. Doc could hear the change in Tremonti's breathing. Good. You want to sell your little movie? Go ahead. But when it goes public, so does everything else. Every medical detail, every ethical violation, every single piece of evidence showing that what happened in that warehouse wasn't some romantic last dance between warriors. It was two sick old men being exploited by people who saw dollar signs where they should have seen human beings who needed help. Doc, listen. No, you listen. Doc was standing now, his voice carrying a strength he hadn't felt in decades. I've spent 40 years protecting Allie and Joe's reputations. But you know what? They don't need my protection anymore. They're dead. Their families are apparently well compensated. The only person who's been suffering is me, and I'm done with that. Through his window, Doc could see more news vans arriving. A small crowd was gathering across the street, phones raised like modern Roman spectators waiting for blood. His quiet Atlantic City exile was over, but for the first time since this nightmare began, he didn't care. Here's what's going to happen, Doc continued, his voice steady now. I'm going downstairs. I'm going to talk to every reporter, every camera, every microphone, and I'm going to tell them the whole truth. Not your sanitized version about noble warriors. Not the family's version about buried legacies. The medical truth. The ugly, brutal, devastating truth about what boxing really does to human beings and what happened when two dying legends refused to accept reality. You can't. The families will sue you into the ground. The boxing commission will strip your credentials retroactively. Your daughter... My daughter is a doctor, Doc interrupted. She'll understand that sometimes telling the truth is the only ethical choice left, even when it destroys everything else. He paused, thinking of Sarah's voice that morning, the worry and love in it, especially then. Doc moved through his apartment with purpose now, gathering the files he'd hidden for 4 decades, the real medical records, the photographs showing 2 men who should have been in hospitals, not a boxing ring, the documentation of his own ethical failures and the system that had enabled them. Doc, we can work something out here. There's money, serious money, enough to set you up for life, enough for your daughter's future. Goodbye, Vinny. Doc hung up and immediately unplugged the phone. Whatever came next, it would happen on his terms. He looked around his apartment one final time, at the fight programs and photographs, at the carefully preserved shrine to his own guilt and shame. Then he began loading the medical files into a canvas bag. It was time to go downstairs. It was time to tell the truth, no matter who it destroyed. The elevator ride down felt like a descent into battle, but for the first time in 40 years, Doc Wellington knew he was fighting on the right side. The elevator doors opened to chaos. Camera flashes erupted like lightning as reporters surged forward, their voices a cacophony of shouted questions that echoed off the marble walls of his building's lobby. Doc stepped out slowly, the canvas bag of medical files heavy in his arthritic hands, and felt the weight of 40 years lifting from his shoulders with each measured step. Dr. Wellington, can you confirm the existence of a secret 1995 bout between... Doctor, what's your response to allegations that you covered up? Is it true that both fighters were medically unfit? Doc raised one hand, and something in his bearing, the quiet dignity of a man who'd carried impossible burdens, made the crowd fall silent. Mrs. Kowalski watched from behind the front desk, her eyes wide with concern and confusion. He gave her a small nod of reassurance before turning to face the cameras. My name is Dr. Marcus Wellington, he began, his voice carrying the authority of decades in medicine. On November 15, 1995, I served as the attending physician for an unsanctioned boxing match between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. What I witnessed that night has haunted me for 40 years. Today, I'm going to tell you why. The reporters pressed closer, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Doc could see the hunger in their eyes, the smell of a story that would define careers. But he also saw something else, a few faces that showed genuine concern for the old man standing before them with trembling hands and eyes full of ghosts. Before I begin, Doc continued, you need to understand that everything you think you know about that night is wrong. This wasn't a story about courage or pride or settling old scores. This was a story about exploitation, about sick men being used by people who saw profit in their pain. He opened the canvas bag and pulled out a thick medical file, its pages yellowed but readable. Muhammad Ali's neurological assessment from 3 weeks before the fight. Stage 2 Parkinson's disease with significant cognitive decline. Reaction time diminished by 40%. Short-term memory severely compromised. His voice cracked slightly. I signed off on him anyway. The crowd stirred, cameras clicking frantically. Doc reached for another file. Joe Frazier's blood work from the same period. Severe anemia. Liver enzyme levels indicating significant damage from years of medication abuse. Blood pressure readings that should have put him in a hospital, not a boxing ring. Doc looked directly into the nearest camera. I signed off on him too. A young reporter with kind eyes stepped forward. Dr. Wellington, why are you revealing this now? Doc almost smiled, because 48 hours ago I thought I was the only person who knew the truth. I thought I was protecting 2 great men's legacies by keeping quiet. Then I discovered that the fight was filmed, that families and managers have been planning to profit from that footage for decades, that I wasn't a guardian of their secret. I was a pawn in someone else's game. His phone, somehow still receiving signals despite being unplugged upstairs, buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. Whatever threats or bribes were coming no longer mattered. "The truth is," Doc continued, his voice growing stronger, "what happened in that warehouse was an atrocity. 2 dying men, pumped full of painkillers and stimulants, beating each other senseless while I stood by and watched. Allie couldn't remember the round number between the 3rd and 4th. Frazier was spitting blood from the opening bell. And I let it continue because I was too weak, too starstruck, too goddamned proud to do my job." Tears ran down his weathered cheeks now, but his voice remained steady. Behind the cameras, he could see building security trying to maintain some semblance of order, but the crowd continued to grow. His confession was being broadcast live, carrying across the internet at light speed. "You want to know what courage looks like?" Doc pulled out the final file, photographs from that night. Not the sanitized images he'd kept in his apartment, but the brutal medical documentation he'd hidden even from himself. Courage would have been stopping that fight in the first round. Courage would have been telling 2 legends that their war was over, that it was time to rest. Courage would have been protecting them from themselves and from the people who were using them. His phone buzzed again. This time he pulled it out and glanced at the screen. Sarah. His daughter's name on the caller ID hit him like a physical blow, but he declined the call and looked back at the cameras. "I failed them that night. I failed as a doctor, as a man, as a human being. But I won't fail them again. Every medical record, every photograph, every piece of documentation from that night will be turned over to the proper authorities. Let the world see what really happened when pride mattered more than health, when profit mattered more than dignity." Doc closed the files and straightened his shoulders. "The truth isn't always noble, but it's always necessary." The November wind cut through his thin cardigan, but he welcomed its bite. For the first time in 40 years, he felt clean. Behind him, the feeding frenzy continued. Camera crews jockeyed for position. Reporters spoke urgently into phones, and somewhere in that electronic storm, his confession was already spreading across the world. By tonight, everyone would know. The families who'd planned to profit from Allie and Frazier's final agony. The boxing commissions who'd turned blind eyes to obvious medical concerns. The fans who'd rather worship false heroes than confront uncomfortable truths. Doc walked slowly down the boardwalk, his canvas bag now empty, feeling strangely light despite the arthritis in his knees. The morning sun painted the ocean silver, and for a moment he could almost see the young doctor he'd once been idealistic, principled, certain that medicine was about healing rather than enabling. His phone buzzed. Sarah again. This time he answered. "Dad?" Her voice was tight with worry. "I just saw the news. Are you—" "I'm fine, sweetheart." And surprisingly, he was. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way. Dad, what you did today—" She paused, and he could hear her choosing her words carefully. It was brave. 40 years late, maybe, but brave. Doc found himself smiling for the first time in days. "Your mother would have told me to speak up decades ago. Mom would have been proud of you today." Sarah's voice was warm now, the doctor in her understanding what the daughter might struggle to accept. "You chose truth over comfort. That's not something everyone can do." They talked for a few more minutes about lawyers, about the media storm, about whether he wanted to come stay with her in Philadelphia until things calmed down. But Doc found himself declining her offers of shelter. Whatever consequences came from today's revelation, he wanted to face them here, in the place where he'd hidden for so long. After hanging up, he continued walking until he reached the old steel pier. The amusement park was closed for the season, its rides draped in canvas like sleeping giants. He sat on a bench facing the ocean and thought about Allie and Frazier. They'd both been dead for years now, Allie in 2016, Frazier in 2011. Both had died slowly, their bodies finally surrendering to decades of accumulated damage. Doc wondered if they'd found peace in their final years, or if they'd carried their own versions of his 40-year burden. The truth he'd revealed today wouldn't bring them back. It wouldn't heal the damage done in that warehouse or undo the medical compromises he'd made. But it might prevent other aging fighters from being exploited by people who saw dollar signs where there should have been dignity. As the sun climbed higher, Doc's phone rang intermittently. Reporters, lawyers, old colleagues whose voices he barely recognized. He answered a few calls, declined most others. The story was already told. Everything else was just aftermath. Around noon, an unexpected visitor found him. Mrs. Kowalski from his building approached the bench slowly, carrying a thermos and wearing the kind of expression reserved for visiting graveyards. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, settling beside him with a soft grunt. Made coffee the way Elena used to. They sat in comfortable silence, sharing coffee that tasted like forgiveness, and watching seagulls dive for scraps along the waterline. Mrs. Kowalski had lived through her own wars. She understood the weight of carrying secrets and the strange relief that came with finally setting them down. "You did the right thing," she said eventually. Doc nodded, watching a container ship crawl along the horizon. 40 years too late. Maybe. But right is right, no matter when it happens. That evening, back in his apartment, Doc began the long process of cleaning out 4 decades of accumulated guilt. He boxed up the fight programs, the photographs, the newspaper clippings that had served as both shrine and torture chamber. Some would go to Sarah, some to charity, some simply to the trash. The apartment felt larger already, less crowded with ghosts. His answering machine blinked with 37 new messages, but Doc ignored them all. The important conversations had already happened. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and consequences and the grinding machinery of accountability. But tonight, for the first time in 40 years, Marcus Wellington fell asleep without seeing 2 broken men beating each other senseless while he stood by and watched. Outside his window, Atlantic City settled into its winter quiet, and the ocean kept its ancient rhythm, indifferent to human shame and human redemption alike.